You're sleeping peacefully in your own home when a knock at the door wakes you. You check the time. 2 a.m. exactly. You ignore it, thinking you imagined it. The next night, same thing. 2 a.m., 3 deliberate knocks. Then again the next night, and the next, and the next. For weeks, every single night at precisely 2 in the morning, someone is knocking on your door. But when you look through the peephole or check your security camera, there's no one there. Now imagine discovering that you're not the only one experiencing this, and that the truth behind these nocturnal visits is far more sinister than any ghost story. Welcome back to Crime Scout, True Stories. Today's case takes us into the nightmare that haunted multiple families in a quiet Oregon suburb, and the disturbing investigation that revealed what was really happening at 2 a.m. It started in September of 2019 when Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old nurse living in a townhouse community outside Portland, began experiencing the knocking. She worked long shifts at the hospital and desperately needed her sleep. The first night it happened, she assumed it was a drunk neighbor at the wrong door. She looked through the peephole, saw nothing, and went back to bed. But when it happened again the following night at exactly 2 a.m., she became concerned. By the fourth night, she was starting to feel genuinely frightened. Sarah did what most of us would do. She checked her doorbell camera footage. But here's where it gets strange. The camera showed no one approaching her door during those times. There were knocks clearly audible on the audio recording. 3 distinct raps, but no visible person. Technical glitch, she thought. She called the camera company, had them check the system remotely, and they assured her everything was functioning properly. So if the camera was working and the knocks were real, how was someone avoiding detection? After 2 weeks of sleepless nights, Sarah filed a police report. The responding officer was sympathetic but couldn't do much without evidence of who was doing it. He suggested she stay somewhere else for a few nights to see if it continued. She took his advice and stayed with her sister across town. During those 3 nights, the knocking at her townhouse stopped, or at least no one was there to hear it. But the moment she returned home, it started again that very first night. 2 a.m., 3 knocks, no one visible. Then something interesting happened. Sarah posted about her experience in her neighborhood's social media group, half expecting people to think she was crazy. Instead, she received a flood of responses. 4 other residents in the same townhouse community reported experiencing identical incidents. Always at 2 a.m., always 3 knocks, always with no one visible on camera or through the peephole. The victims seemed random. Different buildings, different units. No obvious connection between them. The only common thread was the timing and the pattern. Now the police took it more seriously. What had seemed like isolated harassment was clearly a coordinated pattern. Detective Michael Torres was assigned to the case. He started by interviewing all 5 victims and looking for connections. What he found was puzzling. The victims were different ages, different professions, different backgrounds. 2 were single women living alone. 1 was an elderly couple, 1 was a young family with a toddler, and 1 was a male graduate student. There was no apparent relationship between any of them. Detective Torres decided to stake out the community. For 3 consecutive nights, unmarked police vehicles were positioned throughout the complex with officers watching and waiting. 2 a.m. came and went on the first night with no incidents. Same with the second night. The detective was starting to wonder if the presence of police had scared off whoever was responsible. But on the 3rd night, the knocking returned, and what happened next changed everything. At precisely 2 a.m., officers heard the knocking at Sarah Chen's door over the radio communication with her. They'd given her a direct line to report it immediately. Multiple units converged on her building within seconds. They had the area surrounded. There was no way someone could knock and escape without being seen. But when they checked the area, once again, there was no one there. The officers were baffled. They'd responded in under 30 seconds, and somehow the perpetrator had vanished. That's when one of the younger officers noticed something strange. There was a small electronic device attached to the underside of Sarah's doormat. It was about the size of a deck of cards, black and barely visible unless you were specifically looking for it. The device was removed and examined by the police tech unit. What they discovered was both clever and deeply disturbing. It was a custom-built remote-activated knocker. Someone had engineered a small mechanical device with a solenoid that would strike the door from underneath the mat. It was connected to a timer and could be activated remotely via a wireless signal. This meant someone had planted these devices at multiple homes and was either setting them on timers or manually activating them remotely. The police immediately checked the other 4 homes reporting the knocking. Sure enough, each one had an identical device hidden under their doormat or nearby. This wasn't a prank. This was a deliberate, systematic campaign of harassment using custom-built technology. But why? And who would go to such elaborate lengths? The investigation took on new urgency. The devices were sophisticated enough that they'd been built by someone with electronics knowledge. The police consulted with the FBI's Cybercrimes Division and began analyzing the wireless frequencies the devices used. They discovered the devices were being controlled from somewhere within a half-mile radius. The perpetrator had to be relatively close by to activate them. Detective Torres authorized a controversial next step. They left the devices in place but modified them to trace the activation signal. They waited. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Then, on the 3rd night at 2 a.m., the signal was sent. Police traced it to a location approximately 300 yards away, to another building within the same townhouse community. Officers moved in quietly, surrounding the unit. What they found inside shocked everyone involved in the investigation. The apartment belonged to Marcus Webb, a 41-year-old IT specialist who lived alone. When police entered with a warrant, they found an elaborate setup. Multiple monitors, radio frequency equipment, and a detailed logbook documenting every single night he'd activated the devices. But more disturbing was what else they found. Marcus had extensive surveillance footage of his victims. Hidden cameras positioned to capture their doors, their windows, their reactions when they checked outside after the knocking. He'd been watching their distress, documenting their fear, and clearly deriving some form of satisfaction from it. During interrogation, Marcus initially refused to speak, but eventually, with evidence overwhelming, he began to explain his motivations, though calling them motivations is generous. What emerged was a picture of profound social dysfunction and disturbing obsession. Marcus claimed he'd been slighted by these neighbors in various minor ways. Sarah had once complained about noise from a party that Marcus insisted wasn't even in his unit. The elderly couple had reported his car for parking in a visitor spot. The young family's child had apparently kicked a ball into his patio. These were trivial, everyday neighborhood interactions that most people would forget within days. But Marcus had obsessed over them. In his mind, he'd been wronged, disrespected, and deserved revenge. So he'd spent months planning and executing this harassment campaign. He'd taught himself to build the remote devices by watching online tutorials. He'd carefully installed them when his victims were away, using various pretexts to know their schedules. He'd even kept a rating system in his logbook, scoring his victims based on how frightened or frustrated they appeared in his surveillance footage. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court found Marcus had severe social anxiety, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and an inability to process normal social interactions appropriately. What most people would brush off as minor inconveniences, he internalized as major grievances requiring retaliation. The remote nature of his harassment, using technology rather than direct confrontation, fit his psychological profile perfectly. He could inflict distress without actual human interaction, which he found difficult and threatening. Marcus Webb was charged with multiple counts of stalking, harassment, illegal surveillance, and trespassing. The custom nature of his devices and the premeditated planning worked against him. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to avoid trial and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by supervised probation with mandatory psychiatric treatment. He was also issued permanent restraining orders preventing him from contacting any of the victims. For the victims, the resolution brought relief, but also lasting unease. Sarah Chen told reporters she'd moved to a different neighborhood, unable to feel safe in the townhouse community anymore. The others expressed similar sentiments. The violation wasn't just the knocking itself, but the knowledge that someone had been watching them, documenting their fear, treating their distress as entertainment. The psychological scars of being surveilled and toyed with lasted far longer than the knocking itself. This case highlights something we don't always consider in our connected, technology-enabled world. The tools that make our lives convenient can also be weaponized by those with harmful intentions. Marcus Webb didn't need physical strength or traditional weapons to terrorize his neighbors. He needed electronics knowledge, patience, and the complete lack of empathy required to sustain such a campaign. It also reminds us that sometimes the scariest threats aren't strangers lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they're the quiet neighbor you pass in the hallway, someone harboring grievances so disproportionate to their causes that they fester into something dangerous. The banality of evil isn't just a philosophical concept. It's the man in apartment C who spent his evenings watching you panic at 2 a.m. and carefully logging your reactions in a notebook,